Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to all things nuclear.
I'm joined now by Tom Kalina, Director of Policy.
Joe Cirincione, President of the Ploughshares Fund.
Philip Yoon, the Executive Director of the Ploughshares Fund.
Development Director from Ploughshares Fund, Elizabeth Warner.
And here's today's guest host, Michelle Dover.
Thanks, Del. That's right. Your guest host today is Michelle Dover, Director of Programs here at Ploughshares Fund. Joe's away from his desk today, so the ladies are in charge. Joining me is Mary Kaszynski, Deputy Director of Policy at Ploughshares Fund, and Erica Fein, Advocacy Director at Win Without War. This is our early warning segment in which we cover the nuclear news you need in 7 minutes. Why 7 minutes, you ask? Because that's the amount of time the president would have to decide whether or not to launch a nuclear counterstrike when the missiles are inbound. So, clock is ticking. Let's go.
And now, early warning. Early warning. Early warning. Early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Hello and welcome to Early Warning. Joe is away from his office this week, so I will be the one hosting. My name is Michelle Dover. I'm the Director of Programs, and I'm joined here today by Mary Kaszynski, the Deputy Policy Director here at Ploughshares Fund, and our special guest, Erica Fein, Advocacy Director at Win Without War. Welcome, ladies. Are you ready to talk about the news?
Yes.
Very excited. Thanks, Michelle.
So we have 7 minutes, as you guys are aware, about the amount of time the president will have to decide whether or not to launch missiles in the case of a strike. And that time starts now. Mary, what are you looking at?
Well, it was a really exciting weekend on Iran. After last week saying that he doesn't want war with Iran, this weekend President Trump sent a very aggressive tweet about ending Iran if they take any dangerous steps. Again, it was kind of weird coming from the commander-in-chief and very concerning. To emphasize, this is Trump escalating tensions after the administration has taken a number of steps that look to be designed to provoke Iran into taking steps against the United States. Those steps include things like designating Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps a foreign terrorist organization. There are rumors that the administration is looking into deploying over 100,000 troops to the Middle East, that they've directed the Pentagon to draw up those plans. And of course, there was the imposition of a total oil embargo on Iran. So those are the steps that have escalated the tensions and led us to where we are today. Erica, I'm really interested in your take on some of these recent developments.
Yeah, it's very concerning, and I don't see off-ramps, unfortunately, right? So we had the story come out about the over 100,000 troops potentially being deployed to the region. Their sanctions will continue to be imposed, and I think, we need to look for whether or not the administration imposes new sanctions that even further cut off Iran from the international economy. And I think the other thing that we need to look at is whether Iran continues to be in compliance with the nuclear deal. They're not seeing any of the benefits, and they're continuing to be squeezed harder and harder. So who could blame them for not wanting to comply? But I think, they've been doing a good job so far, and they've given the Europeans 60 days to help them decide whether or not to continue. So unfortunately, we have a national security advisor that wants war with Iran and has wanted war with Iran for decades. So we are in a very precarious place now, and hoping that we have a Congress that stands up to Trump to push back against escalation.
Well, it's something we'll certainly keep an eye on. Erica, what else are you looking at this week?
So we got some good news. It's probably not going to make the headlines of the New York Times anytime soon, but we have a Democratic Congress that wants to push back on the Trump administration's dangerous new nuclear weapons that blur the line between conventional and nuclear war in a way that we haven't seen from the United States in a very long time. And this is a low-yield nuclear weapon that you would put on a submarine-launched ballistic missile. low yield seems as if it's a better thing, but the way in which it is being described makes it much more dangerous. And we call it the gateway nuke.
Oh, no.
Yes, exactly. So, gateway into a full-blown nuclear war.
Oh, that sounds like a place I don't want to be.
Right. And so the good news is that the Democrats in the House are trying to zero out funding for this nuclear weapon.
We've talked about, we being, I think, people who in the non-proliferation nuclear policy community have talked about what this means to have Democratic leadership in the House. Is this a part of that stepping up and taking a position on what our arsenal looks like and what it's used for?
I definitely think so. Chairman Adam Smith of the Armed Services Committee has made nuclear weapons one of his top defense priority issues, and making sure that we are right-sizing our arsenal for the 21st century and making sure that we don't go down a dangerous path. And I think that this is the caucus following his very, very strong lead that he's set.
That's great. So definitely something we'll keep an eye on as the budgetary process continues.
Great.
So last week there was a hearing in the House Energy and Commerce Committee on the Department of Energy's mounting cleanup costs from the Manhattan era projects sites. So the cost to clean up the weapons that we made in, starting in the 1940s now range from $377 billion upwards of $494 billion, depending on which report you look at. And these are increases from initial estimates of over $200 billion since 2011. And experts are now saying that it will take decades longer to clean up these sites than initially anticipated. The one that's really increasing the bill is the Hanford site in eastern Washington. There's over 50 million gallons of highly radioactive toxic waste in tanks that are leaking out near the Columbia River. I care because I used to live there, and growing up near those sites, that's your everyday reality. But I think, what does this mean for people around the country, and why should we care? It's, as we talk about, Erica, like you were just talking about, creating new nuclear weapons, I think it's really important that we realize we still don't have a handle on cleaning up the mess that we made for the weapons that we already have.
The legacy of our nuclear weapons arsenal, folks.
You heard it here. So with that, we are almost approaching our time. Is there anything that you want to get in before the missiles land? Erica?
Well, if you guys are interested in doing a deeper dive into the many ways in which we could get into a war with Iran, we have a memo on our website, winwithoutwar.org. You can also check us out on Twitter. We care a lot about preventing a conflict, and we're going to work with Ploughshares and a lot of other organizations and Congress and the media to try and stop this war.
Mary, how about you?
Yeah, I'm really excited about a new poll that came out today. 2/3 of American voters, in response to a new public opinion survey, said that they would support legislation requiring Congress to declare war before the president can order a unilateral nuclear strike against another country. 2/3 is just an incredible number, and I think that bodes well for members of Congress who are really taking a stand against Trump's ability to launch a nuclear war.
Well, the 7 minutes are up. Who knows what decision this president would have made by then. But thank you so much for joining us, and
Thank you.
Come back next week.
Our podcast runs between 30 and 40 minutes. We picked that time because it's the flight time of an ICBM. It's how long it takes a ballistic missile to go from one side of the globe across the oceans to the other. This podcast is going to go almost exactly to that 40 minutes because we have a very special interview for you, and we wanted you to hear all of it. We sat down with Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. He is my senator. I'm from Maryland. He's my friend. I've known him since we were both staff in the 1980s in the Senate and the House, and he's a champion in the Senate for a saner nuclear policy. He sits on the Budget Committee and on the Senate Appropriations Committee, among others, and he uses those positions to fight to defend nuclear security agreements like New START and to improve the U.S. nuclear policy. He is the sponsor or co-sponsor of numerous legislations along these lines, including the bill he introduced, the Preserving Arms Control Treaties Act of 2019, or PACT Act, which seeks to cut funding for any new nuclear weapons that would violate the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that this administration is trying to kill. He's also the co-sponsor of the Hold the Line Act, the bill that would block funding for the low-yield nuclear warhead, the so-called battlefield nuke that President Trump wants to build. And he's a co-sponsor of Ed Markey's S-200, restricting the first use of nuclear weapons act. Chris Van Hollen has been pushing back on this administration's agenda since he was elected to the Senate in 2016. He wants to keep us safe by keeping existing arms limitation treaties. And he's also focused on preventing a new unnecessary war in the Middle East, even as the drums for war with Iran beat louder and louder from the White House. He welcomed us into his office at the Hart Senate office building. We discussed a lot of issues in a very short time. Take a listen. Thank you, Senator, for sitting down with us.
Great to see you, Joe.
Let's start broad.
Yes.
Donald Trump came in and he has re-engineered U.S. nuclear strategy. He's building more weapons with a bigger budget. He's tearing down the arms control regime built by his predecessors. He believes that he can get a better deal with Iran and that he can forge a deal to denuclearize North Korea. How do you think that's working so far?
It's not working out very well right now. It looks like folks in North Korea are thumbing their nose a little bit at the president, and we see this through their recent actions, firing off a couple missiles. And clearly, in the case of Iran, you have an Iranian government that's decided, since the Trump administration is not going to abide by the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, that they're going to give notice that they may start making some moves themselves. And then when you step back at the broader issues regarding strategic nuclear weapons, you've got an administration that seems to want to throw out what has been sort of a bipartisan consensus that strategic arms control agreements have been a way to stabilize competition and avoid nuclear war. So I'm concerned when it comes to the big picture of U.S.-Russia relations, when it comes to strategic weapons, and the regional issues of North Korea and Iran.
You recently wrote a letter to the president, signed by a number of your colleagues, urging him to do what would seem to be an easy, obvious step, which is to just extend the existing New START treaty, the treaty we have that limits U.S. and Russian nuclear forces. Can you tell us why you wrote that letter, and have you gotten a response?
Yes, this should be a no-brainer. Nuclear arms control agreements have served our interests well. They've served the interests of the global community. They allow us to modernize our nuclear forces, our triad, which we should do. But they also allow us to do it in a way where we can monitor what Russia's doing and put some limits on their nuclear forces. And that avoids the spiraling kind of nuclear arms races that you've seen in the past that were unconstrained at times by arms control agreements. So we asked the president to simply extend by 5 years the New START agreement. It expires in 2021 by simple agreement with the Russians. They can extend that till 2026, and that would keep in place the very important verification and monitoring regime. It would allow us to modernize our nuclear forces, but do it in an environment where we know what the Russians are doing. So it's stabilizing, it helps deterrence, helps avoid nuclear war.
Yeah, most people don't realize we've had over 145 inspections on each side, and this is our eyes and ears into what the Russians are doing.
Very important point. If you get rid of this agreement, you're flying blind potentially. I mean, unless both sides somehow agree to extend those provisions.
It's not clear the administration cares. I mean, this is the last standing arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. If it is not extended, we will be without restraints for the first time since 1972. And you also have been weighing in on the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, the treaty that Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev negotiated. We're set to pull out of that. We've given notice. What do you think of that decision?
Well, back in the day, long before I ever thought of running for office myself, I served on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and was involved in the debate over ratification.
Let's tell people how old you are. When was that?
Goodness, that would have been 1988 time frame.
I think that's when we first met. I was on the House Armed Services
We're
Committee.
dating both of us, yes,
and
indeed.
I would see you occasionally when the upper body would agree to have conversations with the House.
There you go. And at those times, you're talking about, Reagan and Gorbachev getting together, recognizing that was an important agreement. And now we've got this administration coming in and tearing it up. And I think it is important to note that the Russians were in violation of the INF agreement. But there are ways to deal.
By the way, have you seen the data?
I've not personally seen the data. There apparently has been consensus within NATO that that's the case.
Right.
The Russians have challenged that. But my point is there are better ways to address Russian violations than the United States being the first to rip up the agreement entirely. An agreement which I believe serves our interests overall. And so the better course of action would be to bring the Russians back into a compliance rather than tearing it up and giving them an even bigger hole to run through.
Right. In fact, when we were serving in the Congress, we saw President Ronald Reagan do exactly that. He accused the Russians correctly of violating the ABM treaty and worked for 6 years until he cajoled them back into compliance, and they tore down the radar at Krasnoyarsk. Remember that?
Yeah, that's a good example of challenging the other side to abide by agreement rather than running to rip it up ourselves.
And it appears that one of the reasons the administration wanted to get out of the agreement was so that we could start building missiles that would be prohibited by the INF treaty. Do you think we need those missiles? And I understand you're taking some action to try and stop them.
Well, we do not need additional missiles to strengthen our own capability. We have lots of layers of capabilities in the European theater. We've got dual-use bombers in Europe. And so the idea that we need to build intermediate range missiles doesn't make sense. It's an added cost with no additional benefit. There's been some argument that we really need to get out of the INF treaty to constrain China and China's nuclear capabilities. China's nuclear arsenal is minuscule compared to ours. There are things we need to be doing in that theater, but getting out of the INF treaty in order to deploy a weapon on Guam, which is what they're talking about, makes no sense at all.
I mean, building a new ground-based cruise missile, presumably capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, but the only place we'd be able to base that would be in Guam.
Well, that's right. I think the Japanese and the South Koreans, our other allies in the region, have been pretty clear that they don't want any nuclear-armed cruise missiles, nor would the Europeans want any kind of nuclear-armed missiles. After all, when we were discussing the INF treaty, it was after the Russians had deployed the SS-20 missiles in the European theater, and we were talking about deploying our Pershing missiles in response. And you can still sort of visualize the protests.
The biggest protests in European history since World War II.
And so they're not going back there. So the notion that we're better off ripping up an INF agreement to build some missiles that our allies don't want to deploy is nonsense.
And this idea that we have to do this because of China, this seems to be a theme that's emerging on the Republican side. Senator Cotton has said, for example, that we shouldn't extend New START unless it includes China. Have you heard this argument? What do you think?
I've heard this argument. Again, this makes no sense. I think that if you look at the Russian and U.S. nuclear arsenals combined, it represents about 95% of the global nuclear arsenal. And so the idea that we should hold up an extension of New START until we get some agreement with China in my view, is just camouflage for the people who want to essentially walk away from the New START agreement. So should we begin some discussions with China with respect to their nuclear forces? Sure, but don't hold up the extension of a major strategic agreement that's in our interest with the Russians because of China.
Yeah, putting out the false idea that we can get a better deal somehow.
Well, that's right. It would take a very long time to bring China into the fold. In my view, it's just an excuse for people who want to delay until the New START goes.
So what can we do to stop the administration from pulling out of the INF Treaty? What can we do to stop them from building this new class of weapons?
Well, first of all, we need to do everything we can by persuasion, which is why I generated a letter signed by lots of my colleagues telling the administration to extend New START. We can try to do this through the budget process as well. For example, on a related matter, the administration is trying to build some new low-yield nuclear weapons, which would reduce the threshold of nuclear weapons use and be very destabilizing. So we can try to address those issues through the budget. But in terms of the larger question of, entering into an arms control agreement, the only way to do that is to get a new administration, which of course gets you into the question of the next elections, because you can't force the President of the United States to extend New START. You hope to persuade them that this is in the best interests of the country. But if that's not successful, then you need to win at the ballot box.
So try to make the case, but don't hold out much hope, particularly when John Bolton's the National Security Advisor.
Right. I mean, John Bolton, as you know, is somebody who's never met an arms control agreement he likes. Of course, he's never been able to make a sound argument as to why we're better off without these nuclear agreements. He's never made a cogent argument as to why we're better off without New START. After all, it provides the visibility that we were talking about, the verification measures, and it puts constraints on the Russian arsenal. But he's there. He's in the White House. He's not far from the president. Seems to have a fair amount of influence within this administration. So if you can't convince people by persuasion, then you need to convince the people around the country to replace them.
And before we get to November 2020, you're on the Senate Appropriations Committee.
Yes, I am.
Is there a chance of restricting or constraining or eliminating the funding for these new weapons?
There is a chance, for sure, especially because in the House of Representatives, Adam Smith, who's the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, agrees that these proposed low-yield nuclear weapons are very destabilizing, that they would reduce the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. And I believe he will eliminate funding for these weapons. We will push for that in the Senate. And then even if we're not successful at eliminating funds for those weapons within the Senate Appropriations Bill, that takes you to a conference committee, and that's where we'll have a discussion.
And there we'll need some popular support, because what the members decide in those conference rooms depends a lot on what they're hearing from their constituents.
Yes, and these two capabilities we're talking about are, as you know, a new low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile, as well as a returning to a nuclear-armed cruise missile, which we abandoned many years ago because we believed it would be unnecessary and destabilizing.
And you've heard them make the case for this low-yield new warhead. Does it make any sense to you at all?
Yeah, it does not, unless you somehow believe in the fiction that we're going to be able to fight and win small nuclear wars around the globe, which is a very dangerous fiction. And the reason we've been successful at avoiding nuclear war since throughout the Cold War period and beyond is because we've recognized that any use of nuclear weapons could quickly escalate to an all-out nuclear war that would obliterate humanity and the planet.
And it's clear to you the reason they want this weapon is to use it. This is a war-fighting weapon.
That's right. The idea here is that this is a weapon that could be used to respond in a battlefield type situation under the pretense that you could actually contain a nuclear conflict to a local battlefield. It is a very dangerous idea, the idea that you're going to wage and try to win sort of small nuclear wars.
How worried are you by the kind of military escalations we're seeing?
I'm very worried. You have an administration that came into office, ripped up a nuclear agreement that constrained Iran's ability to enrich nuclear material and began to squeeze Iran in lots of ways. And now, in the last couple weeks, we begin to hear things coming out of the administration that remind me of some of the sort of misinformation leaking about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction.
Right.
I'm there, so it looks like a replay of sort of the trumped up misinformation that we saw leading up to the Iraq War. So I'm very nervous about it. I'm going to be I've asked for a top-level classified briefing to determine exactly what is the basis for some of the claims that are being made.
Right. Has the administration come up here yet and told the Senate what their intelligence is, what they're doing with the aircraft carrier, the bombers, et cetera?
Let me put it this way. I don't know if individuals have had any briefings, but they've not come up and briefed the United States Senate. So we need to pursue two courses of action. One, every individual senator should be demanding a briefing. And second, I do think it's important that the Senate as a whole have a briefing.
You know, we tend to treat foreign policy different from domestic policy. So people are very aware of how this administration is stiff-arming the co-equal branch of government, the Congress, refusing to respond to 70, I think, different inquiries now. No information, no witnesses. But somehow we think that all that stops on the water's edge. But it strikes me that they're doing the same with our global policy, with our national security policy, going down a warpath without involving the Congress. Advice, consent, information, are you getting any of this?
Well, to even put a finer point on that observation, Congress, of course, has the authority under the Constitution to declare war, right? No administration should be talking about or planning a conflict or going to war without authorization from the United States Congress. And so it is going to be essential that we, the Congress, demand information. This is an administration that doesn't like to provide information to the United States Congress, but we need to step up and demand that when it comes to issues of war and peace, that we get the full information so that we can do our job and find out what's true and what's not true.
Well, I was very impressed that you and Senator Merkley wrote a letter demanding answers on why they structured their arms control compliance report the way they did. You put out a press release on this. I mean, this is kind of a wonky subject, right? Everybody gets these reports. We don't read them very much. But this report, why is this report different from all other reports? Because they didn't give you a lot of the core information, including about Iran. So it strikes me that this is part of their plan. So to not report, they literally did not report that Iran was complying with the JCPOA.
Well, that's exactly right. And Jeff Merkley is another senator who actually in his previous life was involved in arms control
Yes.
issues. And so we've worked
arms
together.
control wonks don't go away.
That's right. We keep coming back. And we've worked together on a number of issues. But you're absolutely right. We wrote to the administration because of what we see as a pattern of withholding important information and distorting information for their own purposes. And when it comes to what seem to be, growing drumbeats from the administration for war with Iran, we need to be on full alert. And when I say we, the American people really need to be on full alert. This is an issue that is on the very front of my radar screen right now. And I'm as concerned as I've ever been about the drift toward war that we appear to be seeing. And, it's very difficult. It's not clear whether this is being done at the initiative of the president or he's being dragged along by the John Boltons of the world. This, of course, has been a long-term goal of John Bolton. At least he has said in the past that the only way to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon is by going to war with Iran.
Title of his op-ed, to stop Iran's bomb Iran.
And of course, the great irony is that the Obama administration was able to prevent Iran from going down the path or putting up major obstacles to any Iranian path to get a nuclear weapon.
Froze it, put it under a microscope.
Absolutely. And, we remember all that talk about how Iran had enough, highly enriched nuclear material to build a bomb. Well, that's all gone away.
Yeah.
And the timeline that they'd have to travel in order to get a nuclear bomb has been extended significantly. So it's no longer short fuse. But this administration has already torn up the agreement, at least the U.S. obligations under the agreement. And now it's like, we're shocked. We're shocked that Iran might think that it no longer has to comply with every part of that agreement as well. I mean, I think the president, thinks he's negotiating with some subcontractor that he stiffed in the past on one of his projects, and that's just not the way it works.
Yeah. Yes. We can't tell for sure whether they're trying to goad Iran into some kind of provocative military action, but they're sure doing good imitation if somebody's trying to do that.
They are indeed.
Let's just close with a brief look at 2020. So you opened up by saying one of the ways to fix this nuclear strategy is replace the people who are writing it. But isn't there another part? What are we going to replace it with? In addition to the people, what do you think a new U.S. nuclear policy should look like, or is that something you're planning to work on in the next 18 months?
Well, I think we all benefit from a robust conversation about how we need to shape our sort of nuclear strategy and arms control posture going forward. But at a minimum, here are some of the elements. Number one, we should immediately extend the New START agreement. I mean, this is a no-brainer for the reasons we've discussed. Second, we should begin conversations with China about how we address some of our concerns in that region, but not tie it to an extension of the New START agreement. Third, we should not be developing destabilizing low-yield nuclear weapons as part of a fictional and very scary idea that you could actually fight and win a regionalized nuclear war. That is a really dangerous and bad idea. We should think about how we can modernize our nuclear forces, but do it in a smart and affordable way. This administration is like somebody who's gone up to the buffet table for a Sunday brunch, and instead of selecting things that make up a good and balanced meal, they want to gorge on every single thing at the nuclear buffet table. And the problem with that is twofold. One is it's super expensive. Unlike a buffet, it's not one price for all you can eat. You got to pay for everything you eat at the nuclear buffet table. And secondly, there are things that we can, when we add them to our arsenal, because somebody wants some new capability, they actually make us less safe by creating instabilities. Because one thing we've learned over the course of many decades is every action causes a reaction, right? I mean, it's no different. If the Russians build some new capability that we think will put us at risk,
Absolutely.
we will respond rationally by building our own capability. If we think that we're going to, put up a new Star Wars defense system to try to block every, Russian ballistic missile, they will try and develop, cruise missiles and are, right?
Underwater drones,
underwater or
yes,
powered
hypersonic.
by, right? I mean, that is just the
never
nature of the nuclear arms race. And so that is why we learned a long time ago, at least we thought we learned on a bipartisan basis, that what makes us more secure is to have some verifiable limits on our nuclear weapons arsenals.
Yeah. Where's Richard Lugar when we need him? Right.
He was a great statesman
Yeah.
in many different ways,
Yeah.
but including...
The epitome of what you just described, a bipartisan basis to make America safer.
That's exactly right. And someone who stuck to the facts, not ideology.
Right. Well, thank you very much for spending this time with us. I want to thank you for your service to the nation. And I want to thank you because I have to write a memo for one of the campaigns on U.S. nuclear strategy, and I think you just gave me that memo.
Well, let me thank you. Thank you, Joe, and your entire team for what you're doing to try to make our country safer, to try to make the world safer, and bring some sanity and reason to this debate.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
And now, a special announcement about an upcoming Ploughshares Fund event.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Fisk, Senior Development Officer at Ploughshares Fund, and I'm here to tell you about an exciting event we have coming up on Monday, June 10th in San Francisco. The event, Chain Reaction 2019, will highlight a new moment we see now to reshape the national debate on nuclear strategy. We are thrilled to have Beatrice Finn as our keynote speaker. She's the executive director of ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. Other speakers include former Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes, author Eric Schlosser, and nuclear historian Alex Wellerstein. Tickets are on sale now at ploughshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Megan McCall. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Theme music is by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.